Hey you. Yes, you. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's get into tonight's true crime case. So, don't forget subscribe this channel and turn on notification. Story 1. There are things that change you, not suddenly, but deeply. Moments that carve into your memory, like slow, quiet weathering. For me, it was a suitcase. One left alone in a dim corridor of a London apartment building, silent, still, and entirely out of place. It was a Tuesday in early April. The air held that indecisive chill of spring, where sun and cold wrestle for dominance. I was walking down the hallway of the building where I often volunteered to check in on elderly tenants, a quiet habit I had picked up after moving to the city. The routine brought me peace. Familiar faces, gentle conversations. Nothing ever happened there. Until it did. The suitcase was there, just past flat 2B. No tags, no motion, no sound. But something about it, its presence, its weight against the silence, struck a chord in my chest I didn't understand at the time. I stopped. I looked at it longer than I probably should have. And I remember this strange thought crossing my mind. This isn't lost luggage. This was left behind. There was no odor, no immediate sign that anything was wrong. Just stillness, the kind that stretches out time. I didn't open it, of course. That would come later, and not by my hands. What followed in the hours and days after that discovery would unravel everything I thought I knew, not just about my neighbors, but about the hidden lives people carry behind locked doors. Lives that are sometimes quietly falling apart. I couldn't have known it then, but that suitcase would become the center of a story that would take hold of the entire city. And somehow, I was right there at the beginning, standing in a hallway I had walked dozens of times, now permanently marked by something I could never unsee. I didn't tell anyone at first. There was something strangely personal about the encounter, like I had stumbled into a private sadness not meant for me. But silence, it turns out, has weight. And by the end of the day, that weight pressed on my thoughts like a stone too large to ignore. Later that evening, I returned to the corridor, half hoping the suitcase would be gone. It wasn't. The building's quiet was different now. The usual comfort had turned brittle, like a song slightly off-key. I walked past it again, slower this time. I noticed things I hadn't before. A faint scuff on the wall. A drag mark leading from the elevator. Subtle. Not alarming, but telling if you were willing to look close enough. The next morning, the police were there. It was Mrs. Kavanaugh who finally called them. She lived 2 floors up and said the hallway smelled unusual. I hadn't noticed a scent, but perhaps I didn't want to. Some part of me had already begun filing things away, wrapping them in gauze so they wouldn't cut too deep. They sealed off the corridor. Officers came and went. Clipboards, cameras, hushed radio chatter. What was once ordinary space became a stage, and I unwillingly had front row seats. I watched from behind the caution tape, from the stairwell, from anywhere I could observe without being asked to move on. I wasn't trying to be nosy. It felt more like responsibility, as though having seen the suitcase first meant I owed it something. Or perhaps I owed something to what it had left behind. News traveled fast. Not in full, not with certainty, but enough to rattle windows and whisper down alleys. The suitcase had contained remains. That word, soft, clinical, distant, became the boundary between what people were willing to imagine and what they refused to know. And just like that, the building I once considered peaceful became a place of questions no one wanted to ask out loud. Their names were Alan and Marjorie Delaney. Unit 2B, second door on the left. The one with the ceramic cat wind chime and a neatly stacked pair of walking sticks beside the mat. Everyone in the building knew them, or at least we thought we did. They were part of the rhythm here. Quiet, predictable, kind. Alan loved crossword puzzles. He would often sit in the courtyard on sunnier days, a pencil behind his ear, squinting at the paper like it was a worthy opponent. Marjorie baked, not often, but well. Every few weeks, a warm tray of something homemade would find its way to the laundry room or the front desk. Not for praise, just because. They were not the kind of people you ever imagined vanishing, let alone this. It's strange how, when something horrific happens, the mind clings to ordinary images like life rafts. I found myself replaying the last time I saw them. Alan was holding the elevator door open for me. Marjorie had just gotten back from a grocery run. We exchanged polite smiles. There was nothing unusual, no tension in the air, no foreshadowing. Just life, moving as it always had. Now their door was sealed shut with police tape. Their names appeared in newspapers, not under community columns or anniversary announcements, but in headlines. Carefully worded headlines that tried not to upset anyone, but always did anyway. No one knew why it happened. Not yet. The suspect, I hadn't seen his face. Only heard murmurs. A visitor, perhaps. A tenant's guest. Someone who had come and gone without ever being truly noticed. And in that realization, something sank into my chest. Because what unsettled me most wasn't just the violence. It was the silence that had wrapped around it. How easily someone could walk into our world, change everything, and leave behind nothing but absence. I found myself walking slower past their door, listening, not for sound, but for memory, as if the hallway itself might offer some explanation. It never did. The days that followed felt longer. The building, once full of small, ordinary sounds, the hum of kettles, the soft click of doors, the gentle rhythm of footsteps overhead, fell into a kind of suspended silence. It wasn't fear, exactly. More like grief, the kind that arrives quietly, takes a seat, and refuses to leave. Neighbors stopped making eye contact in the hallway. The community board on the ground floor, once filled with lost pet notices and birthday invitations, remained untouched. Dust settled on old flyers. No one added anything new. And me? I began avoiding the second floor. Not because I was afraid, but because I couldn't bear the change. That place, that corridor, had once been familiar, predictable, safe. Now it felt like a wound, healing over, perhaps, but never the same. The investigation stretched on. Details were released sparingly, facts wrapped in cautious language. The suspect was in custody. Charges had been filed. There were hearings, court dates, legal terms I didn't understand, and headlines I refused to read past the first few lines. Some neighbors moved out. Others stayed, but grew quieter. The wind chime by the Delaney's door was taken down by the building manager. I almost asked to keep it. I didn't. I couldn't. Months passed. Spring gave way to summer. The second floor corridor was repainted. The carpet was replaced. New tenants moved into 2B. A young couple with a toddler. They smiled a lot, introduced themselves to everyone, brought warmth with them. But the building still remembered. So did I. I kept returning to that moment. The suitcase, the silence, the uneasy sense that something had been left behind, long before anything terrible happened. I wondered if others had felt it, too. That invisible shift in the air. That knowing without knowing. We always think tragedy announces itself with noise. Sirens. Screams. Story 2. I had lived in Jinhua for almost a year when it happened. The city, nestled in the heart of Zhejiang province, had always felt like a balance of pace and peace. Not too fast, not too still. Each morning, the sun would cast soft light through the apartment curtains, and the distant bell of the nearby primary school would echo through the streets below. I taught English at a language center not far from that school. Every Tuesday, I passed by its front gate on the way to work. I often paused, watching the familiar rhythm of young students being dropped off, backpacks too big for their small shoulders, parents waving with sleepy smiles, the low hum of scooters and electric bikes zipping through the intersection. That Tuesday morning was no different, or so I thought. I remember the weather clearly, warm but not yet humid. There was a stillness in the air, the kind that only lingers just before something shifts. I walked past the school gates as I always did, nodded at the crossing guard, and continued on. Life, in all its quiet repetition, was in motion, until it wasn't. I had barely reached the corner bakery when I heard it. Not a sound, but a break in the normal. Sirens in Jinhua are rare. It's a city that hums, not screams. But that morning, something pierced the quiet, a rising urgency, the kind that swells before your brain has time to process why. At first, I didn't connect it to the school. How could I? Moments earlier, I had watched children skipping across the sidewalk, holding lunch boxes and laughing about nothing in particular. But within minutes, the street was folding in on itself. Shopkeepers stepping outside, passers-by pausing mid-step, heads turning toward the intersection I had just passed. I looked back. There was no explosion, no smoke, no chaos in the Hollywood sense. Just people beginning to realize that something had happened. Something very wrong. Motorbikes had stopped in the middle of the road. A woman clutched her chest. A man was speaking rapidly into a phone, his voice thin and rising. The school gates, once bustling with cheerful noise, were now surrounded by red and blue flashes and a thickening crowd. I didn't move. Couldn't. There are moments when your body lags behind your understanding, when your instincts hush and your heartbeat becomes your only guide. I stood there, caught between past and present, the memory of what I had just seen brushing harshly against the reality of what I knew now. Something had shattered the morning. I just didn't yet know what. Page 3, realization. News ingenua travels in waves, not from media first, but from murmurs. That morning, phones came out, messages began to ping, and slowly, the fog of confusion gave way to a single, devastating truth. There had been an incident at the primary school. A vehicle, deliberately driven, had entered the front pedestrian zone during the morning drop-off. Casualties were reported. Some of the victims were students, young ones. The details were unclear, but the grief was already real. I didn't go near the school. I couldn't. Instead, I sat in the bakery, the one with the dusty blue awning, where I had once laughed over burnt coffee and mispronounced Mandarin. That day, I sat in silence, watching the city recalibrate. The shopkeeper turned off the radio. A delivery man removed his hat and stood by the door, unmoving. The street outside, once alive with the energy of a school morning, now carried a different weight. That afternoon, the rain came, unexpected, and almost cruel in its timing, but somehow fitting. It softened the edges of everything, blurring people's faces, folding the city inward like a page being turned too fast. In the days that followed, the school became a site of remembrance. I never returned, but I saw the images. Small bouquets left at the gate, drawings taped to the walls, candles flickering in wind they could not fight. People gathered not to speak, but to stand, together, in silence, as if the act of being present could fill the space where names and faces once lived. As a foreigner, I felt like an outsider to the pain, yet deeply within it. I didn't know the families. I didn't know the children, but I knew the street. I knew the time of morning. I knew the shape of the routine, and I had walked past it just minutes before it had been torn apart. There was anger, of course, on the news, on social media, in the lines of the government statements that tried to hold composure but cracked around the edges. But what I remember most was the stillness, the quiet ache of a city holding its breath. Weeks passed. The street was cleaned, the gate repainted. Students slowly returned. Life, because it must move forward. But something beneath the surface had changed. I still walk that street sometimes. It feels different now, not colder, but more careful. People look up more. They hold their children's hands a little tighter. Even the school bell sounds heavier somehow, like it rings in memory of what was lost. And me? I've stopped walking with headphones in. I listen more. I watch more. I notice. Not because I expect anything to happen, but because I've learned that ordinary mornings can carry extraordinary weight, that tragedy can arrive quietly, unannounced, into spaces we thought were safe. Story 3. It was supposed to be a normal spring meet, the kind where you stretch in the shade of the bleachers, sip lukewarm water from a dented bottle, and listen to sneakers squeak against the lanes. It was early April, and the air had that perfect blend of sun and breeze. Coaches shouted lap times. Friends leaned on fences, cheering between bites of concession stand nachos. I remember tightening my spikes behind the long jump pit when it happened. Not the moment, exactly, but the shift. That subtle ripple. The kind your body notices before your mind catches up. Something about the silence after the relay gun. Something about how the wind stopped moving. Then came the movement, fast, confused, and uncertain. People running, not for time, but for each other. Eyes searching. Coaches crossing the track. The announcer's voice crackling into static before cutting off completely. It was as if the whole meet had been pulled from the track and dropped into something else. Something cold. Something heavy. That was the last normal moment I remember. I didn't see it happen. Most of us didn't. We were warming up, running drills, tying laces, half listening to announcements about heat schedules. But something had cracked through that normalcy. A fracture in the atmosphere that spread fast, like water finding weakness in dry earth. It started with a group of students near the far end of the bleachers, huddled too close, too still. Then the arrival of the school resource officers. Then the sudden urgency with which a coach ran toward the infield, his radio pressed to his chest like it might say something he didn't want to hear out loud. There was no screaming, no chaos, just confusion. And then came the name, Austin Metcalf. At first it was a whisper, unsure and incomplete. Then it gained shape, weight, and sorrow. He was one of us. A teammate to some, a classmate to many. A quiet kid with a strong stride and a soft smile. A boy who ran the 800 like it was poetry in motion. The whispers turned into questions, but answers were few and far between. All we knew was that something terrible had happened near the locker area, that someone had been hurt, that Austin wasn't coming back to the track, and suddenly nothing else mattered. The heats were postponed, some canceled entirely. Our coach gathered us in silence. Even the loudest among us had nothing to say. The track stayed empty for days. Not physically. Practices resumed, cones were laid out, whistles blew, but the soul of the field had gone somewhere else. Something about the air had changed. Even when we ran our usual laps, no one joked or raced ahead. We moved like shadows, each step heavier than the last. Austin's lane was left open at practice. No one said it, but we all understood. His water bottle stayed untouched on the bench. I remember staring at it longer than I should have, not because it meant something at the time, but because it was the last thing that hadn't moved. The school tried its best. Counselors were brought in. A banner was placed near the gym with messages of love and memory. Students wrote in Sharpie on sticky notes and pinned them to the wall. There were more flowers than I thought a high school could hold. But even in those moments of kindness, there was a weight none of us could put down. Some said it was a fight gone wrong. Others called it self-defense. The rumors came fast and blurred together, a flurry of theories too loud to sort through. What we knew for sure was that 2 students had entered that hallway, and only one had walked out unchanged. And for those of us who weren't there, it felt like we were walking through someone else's dream. One where the faces were familiar, but the meaning behind them had shifted forever. The news trucks didn't stay long. They came quickly after. Bright lights, distant headlines, interviews just outside the school fence. Reporters stood where we used to stretch. They asked questions we weren't ready to answer. Then, just as fast as they arrived, they moved on, chasing the next story, the next tragedy waiting to trend. But we stayed. We stayed with the silence that filled the halls between classes, with the sharp ache that came from walking past Austin's locker, with the discomfort of seeing the other student, the one accused, in yearbook photos that hadn't yet been pulled. They said the case would take time. The investigation was ongoing. Lawyers had entered the picture. Self-defense, they said. Others called it manslaughter. We didn't know what to believe anymore, only that a life had been lost, and another forever altered. In truth, I didn't know either of them well. But in a small school, you don't need to know someone deeply for their absence to leave a mark. It ripples through every classroom, every bus ride, every Friday pep rally that no longer feels quite right. You start to notice how quiet some kids have become, how teachers look at the empty desk before starting roll call, how everyone walks just a little slower through that hallway now. And the track? We ran again eventually. The lanes were filled. Races resumed. But nothing about it felt the same. Not because we stopped caring, but because we remembered. By the end of April, spring had fully settled in. The trees around the field had bloomed early that year, soft white petals that clung to fence posts and sneakers alike. We kept practicing, not because we were told to, but because there was something about movement that helped. Running didn't erase the ache. It didn't answer the questions that still hung in the air like fog, but it gave shape to the silence. Each lap, a kind of prayer. Each sprint, a word we didn't know how to say out loud. Austin's name was written on the back of our warm-ups in silver ink. Some of us wrote it on our shoes. I never spoke about it much, but I knew exactly where his pace would have lined up next to mine. Sometimes, during solo runs, I'd imagine he was still there, a quiet rhythm beside me, steady and sure. His family held a memorial. The school let us out early that day. They spoke with strength and with grace I don't think I could have found in their place. They didn't ask for revenge. They asked for peace, for listening, for time. And maybe that's what we all needed most. Not justice shouted from rooftops, not viral anger from people who had never stepped on our field, but time. Time to grieve, time to heal, time to remember a boy who once made this track feel whole. I still run, not for medals, not even for school. I run to remember. I run to keep moving forward. I run because sometimes the best way to carry someone is not in your arms, but in your steps. And every once in a while, when the wind is just right, I swear I hear another set of footsteps just behind me. Light, familiar, and free. Story 4. They say Bristol never truly sleeps. There's always a hum beneath the surface. Traffic on the Clifton Suspension Bridge. Footsteps echoing through the harborside. Voices drifting from old pubs clinging to cobblestone streets. But on the morning of April 3rd, 2025, the city exhaled something darker, something colder. I had just moved into my new flat on Hotwells Road, a modest space above a bakery, with a view of the Avon Gorge that I couldn't quite afford, but justified as creative fuel for my true crime blog. I had always been drawn to stories that twisted the ordinary into the unthinkable, but I never expected one to twist itself around me. It began with sirens, not unusual in the city, but these didn't pass. They clustered, stalled, right by the bridge. Curiosity overruled caffeine. I grabbed my coat, notebook, and recorder and followed the sound like a moth to a flame. The path led to a line of police tape fluttering in the spring breeze. Officers milled about, stern and alert, and a crowd was forming, whispering rumors before facts had any chance to arrive. There was a suitcase. No one said it directly, but it spread through the murmurs. Something had been found in a suitcase below the bridge. It should have ended there, with a cordon and my scribbles, just another urban mystery for my next post. But it didn't, because later that evening, while reviewing my audio files, I heard something strange. Not the official police statements or bystander chatter, but a low, trembling voice behind it all. A man's voice almost drowned by the wind. They weren't supposed to find it, not yet. I rewound the tape, played it again, and again. That night, I realized I was no longer just writing about true crime. I was inside one. Sleep evaded me that night, not because of fear, yet, but because of the gnawing pull of something unfinished, something misaligned. I replayed that voice a dozen times, isolating it, amplifying the background, trying to determine whether it had been real or imagined. But each playback only solidified one thing. Someone had spoken those words near the crime scene. Someone who wasn't meant to be heard. By morning, Bristol felt heavier. The spring sun was out, but it did little to warm the city's tone. News headlines exploded with terms like grisly, unthinkable, double homicide. The suitcase wasn't the only one. Another had been found, and then another, each containing remains, each dumped with an eerie sense of calculation. They called it the suitcase murders. The victims were named a few days later: Albert Alfonso and Paul Longworth. Unrelated men with no clear connection, at least on the surface. But I'd learned from my time digging into past cases that people rarely kill without reason. There's always a thread, however faint, however frayed. I started digging. The public records were slow, and police weren't talking beyond the basics. But social media held its own kind of breadcrumb trail. Albert had posted last from a Colombian restaurant in Clifton just 2 weeks earlier. Paul, a gym owner, had uploaded a blurry photo with a man whose face was half obscured. Someone tall, wiry, expression blank. I magnified it, ran it through a reverse image search. The name Yastin Andres Mascara came back. Colombian, 35, on a visa, known to both men, but in different contexts. A friend to Albert, a tenant to Paul. That thread had a name now. And then, late that evening, my doorbell rang. There was no one outside when I opened it, only a small brown envelope, resting like a whisper on my welcome mat. Inside, a note, just 5 words, printed in all caps. Stop writing or you're next. Threats were something I'd dealt with before, usually digital, often juvenile. But this one felt present. It hadn't come through a screen. It had found my home, my address, my name. That kind of precision doesn't come from idle threats. It comes from intent. Still, curiosity is a stubborn illness. I reported the note to the police. They took it seriously, but not urgently. A detective with tired eyes asked the usual questions. Do you have any enemies? Have you written about someone recently who might take offense? I nodded, listed names, feigned concern. But inside I knew. It was about Mascara. Days passed, and so did the headlines. Public attention, like a candle in the wind, flickered elsewhere. But I stayed focused. The deeper I went, the more tangled things became. Mascara had a record in Colombia. Minor offenses, theft mostly, but nothing violent. Yet witnesses placed him at Albert's flat days before the murder. Surveillance showed him hauling something large into a rental car near Paul's gym the night before Paul vanished. Still, he hadn't been arrested. Not yet. Not officially. Then I received another message, this time digital. A burner email. No subject. One attachment, a single photo. It was taken from behind a window, blurred slightly, like it had been snapped in haste. In the center of a frame, me, standing at the Clifton Suspension Bridge overlook. Not yesterday, not last week. That first day, April 3rd. Someone had been watching me from the start. I looked out the window then, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the street was quiet, empty. The bakery below had already closed. Panic prickled at the edges of my nerves. I reminded myself this wasn't the movies. Stalkers don't always lurk in the shadows. Often they blend in, smile at you in cues, hand you receipts. That night, I moved my desk away from the window. I didn't stop writing. I just made sure to back up everything, twice. Because, by now, I wasn't chasing the story anymore. The story was chasing me. By mid-April, Mascara had finally been arrested. But not because of anything I wrote, at least not directly. Police found human remains in his freezer. That detail gripped the headlines, though they tactfully omitted the full horror. They used words like macabre and shocking, but not sickening or inhuman, though I suspected many editors wanted to. I avoided reading the articles. Instead, I focused on the part that didn't make sense, the motive. Mascara claimed self-defense in one murder. In the other, he pleaded ignorance. The statements contradicted each other. One life was supposedly taken out of fear, the other dismissed entirely. No clear narrative. No connection between the victims. No thread. At least, not the kind I could pull. But something else tugged at me. Financial records showed that Mascara had attempted to access both Albert's and Paul's bank accounts after their deaths. Sloppy? Maybe. Or desperate. But that wasn't the strangest part. It was the timing. He hadn't tried to move money immediately. He waited. Days, in fact. Until after the remains were found. Until after the news spread. As if he wanted to be caught. Or someone wanted him to be. Then came the second envelope. Same size. Same texture. Dropped again while I wasn't home. Inside this time, No threat, no photo. Just a copy of a rental agreement. A flat in Easton. Dated February 2025. Signed by Paul Longworth. But the occupant listed beneath his name? Why, Mascara, sublet approved. It wasn't just a casual connection. They had lived together. Quietly. Off lease. Possibly off record. Paul hadn't just rented to him. He'd brought him in. Why? Something shifted in my gut. Whatever this was, it wasn't just murder. It was partnership. Broken. Maybe betrayed. Maybe silenced. I stared at the rental agreement for a long time, as though the paper itself might confess something if I looked hard enough. Paul had allowed Mascara to live with him quietly. No official record. No landlord's notice. That suggested trust. Maybe even debt. But debt to whom? I spent the next 2 days visiting Easton. The flat listed in the document was still occupied, but not by either of the men. A woman answered the door, a student, soft-spoken, suspicious. She'd moved in at the end of March. The previous tenant, she said, had left in a rush. She never saw him, only the property manager. I asked for the name on the lease. She shrugged. It was already filled. I just moved in. Something didn't line up. Someone had cleared that flat before the police knocked. Someone had erased the link. I took a walk. Sometimes, movement helps the mind loosen knots. I passed newsagents still displaying the front page photos, pixelated images of suitcases, the cold arches of the bridge. And behind it all, that face, Mascara's, barely lit, caught mid-blink like he was being dragged into frame. Everyone saw a monster, but I saw a puppet. The problem was, I couldn't tell who held the strings. Back at home, I went through my notes again, scanned for the patterns I might have missed. One detail jumped out this time, a single post from Albert's archived social media, dated weeks before his death. You can't build a future on blackmail. You just end up buried in your own lies. I'd missed it before, probably thought it was one of those vague emo status updates people post after bad dates or unpaid bills. But now it felt like a scream no one had answered. The next morning, a package arrived. No return address. Heavier than an envelope. Inside, neatly wrapped in brown paper, a phone. Old model. Cracked screen. When I powered it on, a message popped up instantly. Play the last recording and run. The phone trembled slightly in my palm, or maybe it was just me. There was only one file saved under the Voice Memos app, dated April 1st, 2 days before the first suitcase was found. I hesitated, thumb hovering over play, before finally pressing it. The audio clicked to life. The voices were muffled at first. 2 men, one frantic, the other calm. I couldn't identify them immediately, but the accents matched. British. Colombian. Then clarity cracked through. Don't need to do this, man. We can just tell them. Paul's got everything. No one's telling anyone anything. You think I can go back after this? I trusted you. He trusted you. A pause. A sound like a scuffle. Then silence, followed by the heavy thud of something falling. The recording ended. I sat frozen. It wasn't just a confession. It was context. Something had happened between 3 men, not 2. Something involving trust, betrayal, maybe blackmail. Albert had known something. Paul had been caught in the middle. And Mascara? He wasn't innocent. But maybe he wasn't the one pulling every lever either. So who was? The phone vibrated again. A new message. You're late. No number. Just those words. I spent the next 24 hours in near isolation. Phone off, blinds drawn. Only the hum of my laptop lighting the room. I documented everything. Uploaded backups to the cloud. Emailed a trusted friend across the country with a full trail, audio, notes, photos, timestamps. If I disappeared, at least the story wouldn't. Then I made the call. I passed the burner phone and the recording to the authorities anonymously, through a solicitor friend. I said I'd found it near the scene. Let them dig through the chain of evidence. Let them find what I'd started to fear. Mascara hadn't worked alone. By April 29th, the headlines had changed again. Mascara was facing trial for 2 murders. But a second arrest had been made quietly. Someone behind the scenes. Someone not even on the public radar. Paul's business partner, a name that had only surfaced in company documents. He'd helped launder money, move assets, and allegedly supply threats. The rental arrangement? A front. The blackmail? Real. And mascara? Possibly just the volatile result of pressure, desperation, and a final breaking point. The city never really found closure. People prefer monsters they can fit into single frames. Complicated truths are harder to headline. Spring faded into summer, and the city exhaled again. Not with peace, but with exhaustion. Another crime story tucked into the archives, filed under too much, too fast. As for me, I moved out of Hotwells, swapped my small flat for a quiet town outside the city. Somewhere the night air carries birdsong, not sirens. But I still write. And sometimes, late at night, I still play the audio. Not for the voices, not for the evidence, but for the reminder. Every story has layers, and the worst monsters rarely show their teeth. They simply ask you to stop writing and wait to see if you do. Story 5. I never thought my last assignment as a freelance investigator would lead me to crisscross the very veins of France's prison system. What started as a casual research inquiry for a documentary producer in Lyon turned into a front row seat to one of the strangest, most synchronized and unsettling attacks on state infrastructure I'd ever witnessed, not from the outside, but from within. It began in early April 2025. The initial headlines were vague. A fire outside the perimeter of a small correctional facility in Toulouse. A disturbance near Marseille involving a stolen van and fireworks. Then, within 2 days, 6 more incidents spread across the map like splattered ink. Prison gates scorched, security vehicles set ablaze, mysterious graffiti sprayed at each site bearing the same acronym, DDPF. I remember sitting in a cheap cafe near Gare de Lyon, watching the news roll on a flickering screen, while locals pretended not to notice. There's a quiet stoicism in French cities when it comes to unrest. They've seen protests, strikes, blackouts. But this was different. This wasn't a demonstration. It was coordination. As someone who had been tracking political extremism and underground organizations for the better part of a decade, I felt a pull immediately. These weren't isolated acts of vandalism. They were staged with precision, too clean to be random, too calm to be panicked. On April 13th, the situation escalated. That night, over a span of 4 hours, simultaneous attacks hit 3 major prisons: Fleury-Mérogis, La Santé, and Baumettes. Surveillance footage, leaked through anonymous channels, showed masked individuals using smoke bombs and crude but effective tools to disable security cameras and light structures on fire. No inmates were harmed. No guards were attacked directly. That was the strangest part. It wasn't about hurting people. It was about making a point. The acronym DPF began flooding my inbox from every corner of the internet. Deep web forums, open protest channels, even anonymous tip emails. No one knew exactly what it stood for, though speculation ran wild. Droits des prisonniers français? Démanteler des prisons faillies? Everyone had a theory, but no one had proof. I booked a train to Marseille the next morning. Once there, I interviewed a former guard who had retired 6 months earlier. He didn't want to go on record, but he offered me insight over strong coffee and the kind of silence that stretches out just long enough to say what words won't. According to him, the prison system was tense. Overcrowding had reached a dangerous peak. Staff morale was bottoming out. And somewhere inside, both inmates and guards whispered about an awakening, a shift in the atmosphere. Not a riot, a philosophy. I was piecing together a map, literally. I marked each incident's location, each known time, and each suspected motive. A pattern was emerging. The attacks followed a route, not a line, but a spiral, outward, from the capital to the periphery. They were sending a message. A countdown, maybe. But to what? On April 19th, I found myself in a quiet commune just outside Strasbourg. The location wasn't random. It was home to a now abandoned detention center, closed after a human rights review in 2023. I was following a lead, an anonymous digital trace that suggested DPF had filmed one of their manifestos there. The building was silent when I arrived. Boarded windows, faint scent of ash lingering in the air. I wasn't trespassing, at least not technically, but it felt like I was being watched. Not in the paranoid sense, in the anticipatory one. Inside, I found the remnants of a small gathering. Burned candles, a circle of chairs. One wall bore a phrase in bold, clean lettering. A system that cages cannot claim justice. It wasn't revolutionary. It was intentional. Next to it, a USB drive taped to the back of a rusted locker. I took it, half expecting it to be empty, or worse, a trap. But it wasn't. It contained a single video file, no voice, no narration. Just footage of cells, cramped, gray, and motionless. Overlaid were statistics, France's inmate population, the ratio of prisoners to guards, disciplinary infractions, suicide rates, sentences served without trial. Then a statement. We are not here to burn the system. We are here to expose it. This is not chaos. This is accountability. That was it. No threats. No manifesto. Just data and silence. And then nothing. For 5 days, the country held its breath. No attacks. No graffiti. No media statements. And just when the Interior Ministry declared it under control, the final strike hit, not at a prison, but at the headquarters of the National Corrections Board in Paris. April 24th. The lobby was flooded with pamphlets, not fire. The sprinkler system had been hacked, triggered by a USB planted in the mainframe. No damage. No injuries. But hundreds of printed sheets fluttered down from the upper levels like confetti. We are not the threat. We are the mirror. By then, the acronym DPF had gone mainstream. Pundits debated it. Politicians condemned it. Academics romanticized it. And yet no one had been caught. No arrests. No photos. No suspects. Like smoke through the cracks, they had disappeared. And I returned to Lyon, exhausted but clearer than I'd been in years. The story I uncovered wasn't one of destruction. It was one of attention. It forced me to question the way we define violence. Is it always fire and force? Or can silence be louder? Can absence be disruptive? I filed my report, but didn't publish it right away. Some stories aren't finished just because the page ends. The following month, I received a plain envelope in the post. No return address. Inside was a single phrase, handwritten in French. Real prisons are built from ideas, and ideas, unlike walls, can burn. That was the end of their message, and maybe the beginning of mine. Story 6. They say the ocean never forgets. It was a phrase that stuck with me the moment I first walked the stretch of Gilgo Beach, Long Island, a seemingly tranquil, breezy place where the shoreline conceals one of the longest and most haunting investigations in recent American criminal history. The Gilgo Beach serial killings had become the sort of case that haunted both headlines and investigators' minds for over a decade. Yet, in April 2025, the tide finally returned a name, 2 names, in fact, that would ripple through everything. I wasn't a cop. I wasn't a detective. I was something in between a freelance criminal analyst and researcher, called upon when law enforcement wanted an external eye, or when journalists needed context the internet couldn't provide. My focus had long shifted to long-term unsolved crimes, the kind that nested in dust-covered boxes and faded press clippings. Gilgo was one of them, always there, waiting. I remember the morning the email came in. It was from a contact I'd worked with on a New Jersey cold case years ago, now embedded with a forensics unit attached to the Suffolk County investigation. The subject line was simple: we have a match. That was it. No names, no files. But I knew instantly what it meant. For nearly 14 years, among the remains found near Ocean Parkway, there had been 2 whose identities evaded us. One adult woman and a toddler, believed to be her daughter. They had been listed as Peaches and Baby Doe, named after the peach tattoo found on the adult victim's torso. And now, in April 2025, after years of technological stagnation and legal bottlenecks, a single familial DNA match had provided clarity. The woman was Tanya Denise Jackson. The child, Tatiana Marie Dykes, just 2 years old. The announcement wasn't public yet, but it would be soon. I had less than 48 hours before every media outlet in the country devoured the story. And in those precious hours, I did what I always do. I went to the places the victims had once called home. Tanya had been from the Bronx, a foster care system veteran. Her life was stitched together with instability and resilience. She had bounced between shelters and subsidized apartments, her name flitting across outdated databases like a forgotten rhythm. Tatiana, her daughter, had been born into the same cycle. No stable residence, few consistent family members, barely any records after the child turned 1. I traced them to a community center in Mount Vernon, where Tanya had attended parenting classes briefly in 1999. The records were paper, faded handwritten, but real. I found a volunteer log with her signature. Neat, intentional. She had tried. Despite everything, she had tried. And then, in 2003, she vanished. No missing persons report. No social media panic. Nothing. No one had been looking for her, because no one even knew she was gone. That was the cruelty of the Gilgo Beach case. Many of the victims had lived lives so transient that their disappearances weren't noticed, or worse, dismissed. The forensic team had used a combination of advanced kinship DNA analysis, archived hospital samples, and a recent genealogical match from a distant cousin who had uploaded her profile to an open-source ancestry database. That was the spark. That was all it took. Once Tanya's identity was confirmed, Tatiana's followed. But identity is not the same as justice. Knowing who they were didn't tell us why they died, or who took them from the world. And so I began searching for the space between the facts, those soft, overlooked margins where context often lives. The case files revealed Tanya's last known address, a basement apartment in Yonkers. It had long been demolished, but neighboring properties remained. And with enough cross-referencing, I found a woman who remembered a quiet girl with a baby and sad eyes living 2 doors down in 2002. She kept to herself. The woman said in an affidavit I would later help submit. I think she was scared of someone. A man used to come around. I didn't like him. He had Long Island plates that aligned with another known detail. The suspected Gilgo killer had operated from Suffolk County. Whoever had taken Tanya and her daughter had likely brought them east, away from city scrutiny, into the quiet anonymity of beachside communities in off-season. Still, the identity alone did something powerful. It rehumanized the case. For years, Tanya had been Peaches. A tattoo, a composite sketch, a memory stored in a manila envelope. Now she was real. Her daughter, too. They were names that could be written on a headstone, not just labels in a cold case archive. The Suffolk County Police Department held a press conference days later. It was delicate, reserved. The commissioner delivered the statement with the tone of someone exhausted by the wait, humbled by the breakthrough. No new suspect was named. No charges announced. Just a promise. We owe it to Tanya and Tatiana to finish this. I sat at the back of the room, notepad in hand, but I didn't write anything. Not that day. Instead, I listened. And when the conference ended, I didn't rush out to publish. I took a train to Babylon, rented a car, and drove the winding route back to Gilgo Beach. I parked along Ocean Parkway, near the mile marker where Tanya's remains had first been discovered back in 2010. The dunes rolled quietly under the April wind, whispering across sand and seagrass. It was strangely peaceful, even sacred, and somehow devastatingly ordinary. There were no memorials here, no signs or markers, just silence. I walked until the breeze grew colder, the surf louder. I stood in the same place the detectives had once stood, not in search of answers, but to feel the weight of the story. I remembered a line from an old investigator I once interviewed. Solving a case is only half the work. The rest is making sure they're not forgotten. Now Tanya wasn't forgotten, nor was Tatiana. But there was still work to be done. Back at my hotel, I began constructing a timeline. Not just the timeline of their disappearance, but of a system that failed them. Missed welfare checks, understaffed agencies, a court system too crowded to notice the falling through of cracks. The killer, Whoever they ultimately are did the irreversible. But the silence that followed, the blind eyes and numb institutions, allowed it to persist. That was the real horror, not the beach, not the mystery, but the waiting. Tanya and her daughter had waited 20 years for someone to speak their names. Now we had them, and with names come memory. With memory, maybe, eventually, justice. The ocean, I realized, may never forget, but it also never speaks unless someone listens. That's what I was here for. To listen, to record, to remember, and to make sure they were never Peaches and Baby Doe again. They were Tanya and Tatiana, and they mattered. Story 7. Australia had always struck me as a land of brightness, blue skies, red earth, and golden shorelines. A continent where danger often came in the form of natural elements, fire, flood, wildlife. But in April 2025, I came face to face with a different kind of danger. One quieter, colder, and far more intimate. It began, as many stories do now, with a push notification. Teen's death in NSW reclassified as murder. Suspect found dead in custody. I had just returned to Sydney after a stint documenting environmental activism in Victoria. I wasn't looking for a new assignment. In fact, I was on the verge of taking a break altogether. But something about the headline stopped me cold. The victim, Audrey Griffin, 19 years old. At first, the authorities believed she had drowned. Her body was recovered near a lake in regional New South Wales, with no initial signs of struggle. It was labeled a tragic accident, perhaps a fall, perhaps intoxication, the kind of quiet conclusion that closes a case before it even begins. But it wasn't over. Within days, her family began to raise alarms. The bruises, the inconsistencies in the report, the fact that Audrey hadn't been seen for more than 24 hours before the body was discovered. None of it added up. They pushed. They questioned. They refused to accept silence. And, in doing so, they cracked something open. On April 22nd, authorities arrested Adrian Torrance, a man in his mid-40s with a documented history of domestic violence and coercive control. He had known Audrey. That much was clear. How they knew each other was less so. Rumors swirled. Some spoke of a romantic relationship, others of manipulation masked as mentorship. I didn't listen to the noise. I wanted facts. But 2 days after his arrest, Torrance was found dead in his cell. Suicide, the report read. Case closed. Except it wasn't. That was when I boarded a train headed northwest, away from the coast, deep into the hushed stillness of rural New South Wales. I arrived in a town that barely had a name on the map, small, sunburnt, and frayed around the edges. It wasn't hostile, just closed. Strangers stood out here, and journalists even more. I introduced myself as a writer, not a reporter, not an investigator, just someone trying to understand. That was partially true. I wasn't there to exploit Audrey's story. I was there to bear witness. At the local general store, I found a bulletin board filled with birthday cards, job notices, and one fading photo of Audrey taped between them. No headline, just her smile. She was young, strong, the kind of young woman who'd gone unnoticed by most systems until she disappeared. The woman behind the counter noticed me staring. She came in here every Friday, she said. Always bought 2 bottles of kombucha and a chocolate bar. That was the first detail I wrote down, not because it was relevant to the case, but because it was real, human. It reminded me that she was more than a name in an article. Over the next week, I spoke with anyone who would talk, teachers, neighbors, friends who knew her from school. Audrey had dropped out in year 11, not because she couldn't cope, but because she said she needed space. One teacher described her as fiercely independent, but tired. Another said she had eyes that always looked like they were searching for something. Then came the more difficult pieces. There were whispers of Adrian Torrance long before the arrest. A man twice her age, charismatic in public, menacing behind closed doors. He was known, but never charged. He had partners before Audrey, most of them reluctant to talk, most of them with stories hidden behind haunted silences. Audrey had met him at a volunteer event the previous year. That much was confirmed. From there, her contact with old friends grew sparse. Her posts on social media became less frequent. Her family, though loving, described her as fading. She stopped talking about her future. By March 2025, she had moved into a temporary share house, supposedly for work. It wasn't clear how much of that was true. Her texts became shorter. Her responses delayed. Then nothing. The night before her body was found, CCTV captured Torrance's vehicle heading toward the lake. He claimed he dropped her off, that she wanted time alone, that she was depressed. But the autopsy told a different story. It wasn't just drowning. There were signs of restraint, signs of struggle. The initial report had failed to document them. Whether it was incompetence or something more deliberate, no one could say. But after public pressure surged, led by Audrey's mother and a groundswell of support from domestic abuse advocates, the reinvestigation began. And now, Torrance was gone. In some ways, it felt like a neat ending. Too neat. I kept digging. His suicide note, if there was one, had never been released. His last online searches included legal terms. His final phone calls were to numbers not publicly listed. I filed requests, press contacts, and waited. Eventually, a redacted report landed in my inbox from an anonymous source. It was thin, heavily censored, but one sentence was untouched. Subject exhibited no signs of suicidal ideation during intake screening. He hadn't been flagged. He hadn't been monitored. And then he was dead. What remained now was a vacuum. No trial, no closure, just a family left with questions. A girl whose story barely made the national news cycle, and a community grappling with a truth it had long tried to ignore. I spent one last morning at the lake where Audrey had been found. It was calm, glass-like, reflecting the early autumn sun. I sat there for hours just thinking about cycles, about how easily vulnerability is mistaken for consent, about how control can look like love when no one's paying attention. Before I left, I took a photo of the shoreline, not for publication, just for myself, to remember that quiet doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes, it's just a place where pain gets hidden best. Audrey Griffin was more than a victim. She was a story that deserved better telling. A life interrupted by violence, but also ignored by the very structures meant to protect her. And so I wrote, not for headlines, not for clicks, but for history. Because somewhere out there, another girl was being told her instincts were overreactions, that her discomfort was her fault, that love was supposed to hurt sometimes. And I wanted her to read Audrey's name and know it isn't. Story 8, April 17th, 2025. Sydney woke up with a crispness in the air that had become rare. The morning light splashed across the iconic skyline, painting the city in hues of orange and gold. On the surface, everything seemed as it always was, busy, bustling, alive. But beneath the surface, something was changing, something darker. I wasn't in the business of following local crime stories. That had never been my specialty. I was a writer by trade, focused on long-term investigations, overlooked cases, and the ripple effects of crime across entire communities. My work took me to small towns, far-off places, and forgotten corners of history. But when I saw the headline, I felt an undeniable pull. Mother kidnapped in broad daylight. Children left behind in Sydney's suburb. The headline wasn't sensationalist, but the details that followed certainly were. A 45-year-old mother of two had been abducted from her own home in Bankstown, a suburb in western Sydney. It wasn't a dark alley or a deserted street corner. It happened in broad daylight, in the comfort of her own living room. Her children, ages 8 and 12, had been there, witnesses to it all. But worse than the abduction itself was the discovery that came later that evening. Her body was found, charred beyond recognition, in a burned-out vehicle in Beverly Hills, just a few kilometers from where she had been taken. Her name was Carla Lorenzo da Silva. By the time I arrived in Bankstown, the media circus had already packed up and left. The story had made the rounds for a day or two, but then it fell to the back pages. I arrived a few days later, seeking what the headlines never gave. I wasn't there for speculation. I was there for answers that went beyond the surface. I started with the house, a modest two-story home with a well-kept garden and faded paint on the windowsills. Carla's neighbors were mostly quiet people, but the kind who knew enough about everyone else. I knocked on doors, asking questions no one wanted to answer. Most of them had seen nothing, heard nothing, but there were whispers, small details, woven together like fragments of a jigsaw puzzle no one had bothered to assemble. Carla was a mother who worked 2 jobs, nights in a local diner and mornings at a call center. Her children, Kira and Lucas, were well-liked but often quiet. Their father, who lived in a neighboring suburb, had been separated from Carla for over a decade. There had been no reports of domestic violence, no restraining orders. She had been the picture of a woman trying to make ends meet, balancing work and family with strength that no one seemed to question. Except someone did. Someone had been watching. The first clue came from a neighbor I found sitting on her porch, peeling an orange. She wasn't the type to invite you in for tea, but she was sharp. When I asked her if she'd seen anything unusual, she paused before offering a single sentence. I don't know much, but I saw a car parked outside their house the night before, one I've never seen before. Dark color. Didn't think anything of it at the time. That car, I learned, was a rental. And it wasn't the only clue that had been overlooked. In the days following the abduction, investigators had sifted through the usual suspects, ex-partners, disgruntled colleagues, even potential stalkers. But no one had the motive. No one seemed to care enough to go that far, until they found Carla's phone. I managed to get my hands on a record of the last few calls made from her device. The final one was placed just hours before her disappearance. It was to a man named Adrian Torrance, a 42-year-old contractor from a nearby suburb. His name didn't ring any bells initially, but as I dug deeper, I uncovered something more disturbing. Adrian had been involved in several domestic disputes in the past, all unresolved. His reputation shadowed by rumors of violence and intimidation. He had been an occasional visitor to Carla's house, according to some of her friends, but no one had thought it strange. He was a charming man, good at blending in, making people feel comfortable. And for the longest time, no one thought to question him. I couldn't shake the feeling that the people who knew him had missed something, maybe ignored it because he was outwardly harmless. But there was more. By the time I was speaking to his neighbors, I learned that Adrian had made several trips to Bankstown over the previous months. Sometimes he would show up unannounced, lingering for hours in his car in front of Carla's home. A casual observer wouldn't think much of it, but I had learned by then that no detail was too small. And there it was, one of those rare moments when the pieces finally clicked together. Adrian Torrance had been watching Carla. But why? When the police finally caught wind of Adrian's connection to the case, they moved quickly. He was apprehended at a remote property he owned outside the city. The fact that he had a second home wasn't the most unusual part. What was strange, however, was that the property was practically isolated. It was as though he wanted to disappear. The discovery inside the house was chilling, though not in a way that was immediately obvious. There were no clear signs of struggle or violence, but there was something unsettling about the way Adrian had arranged his belongings. His personal files, his tools, all meticulously organized. But it wasn't just the mundane details that caught the attention of the investigators. It was the way his computer showed traces of research into Carla's past, her family, her finances, even her children's school records. The motive, it seemed, had been more calculated than anyone could have imagined. Adrian had been planning this for months, and in his twisted mind, the abduction wasn't an impulse. It was a step in a much larger, more deliberate scheme. I spent the next few weeks tracking down any information I could find on Adrian Torrance. His family, his friends, his work contacts, everyone had a different story. Some described him as a quiet, thoughtful man. Others spoke of him as someone who had once been involved in shady dealings, a man who knew how to cover his tracks. But one thing was clear: his connection to Carla had been more than just a passing affair. It was deeper, darker, more dangerous. He saw her as someone he could control, someone he could manipulate into submission. And when she refused, He took matters into his own hands. His arrest came too late. The damage had already been done. Carla Lorenzo da Silva was gone, and so was the woman she might have been. Her children, Kira and Lucas, were left to rebuild their lives, scarred by a tragedy that should never have happened. As for me, I continued to follow the case, watching as the legal system slowly ground its gears toward justice. But the truth was, the case had already consumed me. I had seen too much, uncovered too many layers of a story that went beyond a simple act of violence. It was about power, control, and the way a man could manipulate his surroundings until he thought he was untouchable. But he wasn't, and in the end, neither was Carla. Her death, though tragic, had sparked a conversation about the overlooked violence in everyday lives. It was a conversation that had started in Bankstown, but it had stretched far beyond. People began to question, to search for the signs they had missed in their own lives. For me, it wasn't just about the case. It was about the silence we all carry, the way we ignore things, the way we let things slide because we think someone else will take care of it. But sometimes no one does. And by the time they catch up, it's too late. Story 9, April 2025, began with an unusual sense of unease. I had just finished a lengthy investigation into financial fraud in Europe and was looking forward to a quieter few weeks when I received an unexpected email. The subject line was simple, urgent, confidential information, do not share yet. The email was from an old colleague at the National Crime Agency, someone I'd worked with on a few high-profile cases over the years. I clicked it open, intrigued but cautious. The body of the message contained only a few words. There's a plot against Holly Willoughby. It's real. We've intercepted it. Details to follow. For a moment, I stared at the screen, unsure of how to react. Holly Willoughby was one of the UK's most beloved TV presenters, famous for her cheerful demeanor and prominent role on morning television. She was, for lack of a better term, part of the fabric of British television. To think that anyone could be planning harm against her seemed impossible. But my colleague's words held weight. They weren't to be dismissed easily. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, trying to make sense of what I had just read. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, secure email exchanges, and messages that arrived at odd hours. The National Crime Agency had indeed intercepted a kidnapping plot against Holly Willoughby. The details were sketchy at first. The plot had been uncovered during the investigation of a suspected crime syndicate operating out of London. The syndicate, known for organizing high-profile abductions and ransom schemes, had been under surveillance for months. Holly Willoughby had been chosen as their next target. But why? Why her? She wasn't just a celebrity. She was a household name, a woman with millions of fans who adored her. The motive behind the kidnapping was unclear, but the authorities had reason to believe that it wasn't about money alone. There was something more at play. I was called in as an independent consultant to help with the investigation. My role was to assist in piecing together the puzzle. Why Holly, and who was behind it? The fact that the plot had been uncovered was a relief, but the danger wasn't over. The would-be kidnappers were still out there, and they were planning something that, if successful, would have been disastrous not just for Holly, but for her family, her career, and the public trust in the safety of high-profile individuals. I arrived in London on April 9th, 2025, just as the investigation was gaining momentum. I met with the team at the National Crime Agency, including a group of senior agents who had been leading the investigation. Their faces were drawn, tired from weeks of surveillance, but there was a palpable sense of urgency in the air. The plot had been discovered in a series of encrypted messages intercepted by an intelligence agent working within the syndicate. According to these communications, Holly was set to be taken in the next week. The kidnappers had a carefully planned operation, with a location near her home in West London designated as the site for the abduction. The plan was simple but effective. Grab her while she was returning from her show, and keep her hidden until their demands were met. As the investigation progressed, we learned more about the people behind the plot. They were highly organized, using advanced technology and careful timing to carry out their plans. This wasn't the work of amateurs. The syndicate was connected to several high-profile kidnappings across Europe, and their MO was disturbingly consistent. They targeted individuals with high public profiles, carefully researching their routines, their movements, and their vulnerabilities. Holly's schedule was meticulously mapped out. Every detail of her day, from her morning routine to her drive to the studio, had been studied. The syndicate knew when she would be leaving the studio, where she would park her car, and which route she would take to get home. It was chilling to think how closely they had been watching her. The NCA had already put a plan in place to protect Holly, but they needed more information. They needed to know who the masterminds were, how they intended to execute the plan, and, most importantly, how to prevent it from happening. That's where I came in. I spent the next several days reviewing the intercepted communications, analyzing the syndicate's movements, and consulting with the NCA agents on the ground. My role was to help piece together the missing parts of the puzzle, to predict the next moves of the criminals, and to ensure that Holly's safety was prioritized. What struck me the most during this time was the sheer professionalism of the syndicate. They were not motivated by fame or recognition. They didn't care about the media frenzy that would follow if they succeeded. Their sole interest was in the act itself, the control, the power, and the manipulation. It wasn't just a kidnapping for ransom. It was about making a statement, about showing the world that they could take anyone, even someone as beloved and famous as Holly Willoughby, without anyone even knowing until it was too late. As we closed in on the syndicate, the tension escalated. The team worked around the clock, monitoring Holly's movements, tracking the suspects, and setting up surveillance in key locations. The threat was still imminent, but there was a sense of optimism. We were on the verge of cracking the case wide open. April 15th arrived, and the plot was finally foiled, not through sheer force, but through careful planning and timing. Thanks to the tireless work of the NCA agents and the intelligence gathered from the intercepted messages, they were able to locate the safe house where the kidnappers had planned to hold Holly. At the same time, they executed a sting operation, arresting the members of the syndicate one by one before they could put their plan into motion. The details of the arrest were kept under wraps, but it was clear that the syndicate had been taken down before they could carry out the kidnapping. Holly Willoughby was safe, but the experience had shaken her. It had shaken all of us. In the aftermath, I spent several weeks in London, helping to debrief the NCA and working on a report for the public. Holly's team kept a low profile, understandably, but the news eventually broke, and the nation was shaken by the revelation that such a plot had been so close to succeeding. The truth was, I had never expected to find myself in the middle of something like this. I had worked on many cases, seen many dark corners of the world, but this one felt different. It was personal in a way that I hadn't anticipated. Holly Willoughby wasn't just another celebrity. She was someone whose face was a part of everyday life for millions of people. To think that someone had planned to rip her from that world, to shatter the peace and stability of her life, was a stark reminder of how vulnerable anyone could be. The aftermath of the operation was bittersweet. While Holly was safe and the criminals were caught, the threat they posed was still present in the world. There would always be others who would try to exploit vulnerabilities for their own gain. And while the NCA had foiled this particular plot, they knew that they couldn't rest easy. The syndicate might have been dismantled, but others would rise in their place. For me, the case served as a reminder of the hidden dangers that lurk just beneath the surface, the quiet threats that can spiral out of control without warning. The investigation had been a success, but it had also left me with questions that would stay with me for a long time. How many other lives were being watched without their knowledge? How many other plots were brewing, just out of sight, waiting to emerge? The world was safer for Holly Willoughby, at least for now. But the rest of us? We could only wonder if we were next. Story 10. I've always considered myself a skeptic when it comes to stories of missing people. In my line of work, I've encountered more than enough false leads, exaggerations, and conspiracies to know that the truth is often far less thrilling than the stories people tell. But April 2025 was different. It started with an email, a simple, straightforward message from a law enforcement officer I had worked with in the past. The subject line was clear: missing teen in Missouri, now found in Colorado. Urgent. The email contained a brief summary of a case that had been growing in intensity for several weeks. A 16-year-old girl named Eliza Hall from St. Louis, Missouri, had gone missing in early March. Her family had reported her disappearance after she failed to return home from a friend's house. No leads, no signs of forced entry, just a teenage girl gone. At first, it seemed like any other case of a runaway teen. However, after a few days of investigation, things had taken a turn. It wasn't just about a missing girl anymore. Eliza had been spotted in various locations across the Midwest, traveling by bus and occasionally using a false name. As weeks passed, authorities were getting more concerned. Her family was devastated, and the local authorities were at a loss. By April 15, 2025, new developments had emerged. Eliza's phone pinged on a bus route heading toward Colorado. Law enforcement in St. Louis contacted local authorities in Denver, who were now involved in the case. That's when things started to get real. I was asked to assist in tracking the case, not because of my experience with abductions, but because I was a writer who often worked with law enforcement on high-profile missing persons cases. My role was to lend an outsider's perspective, one that could break through the noise and help focus on what mattered. I agreed, but in the back of my mind, I kept wondering if I was chasing yet another wild goose. When I arrived in Denver a few days later, the situation was still in flux. Eliza had been seen getting off a bus at the Greyhound station in downtown Denver, but there were no further confirmed sightings. The police had set up surveillance around key transportation hubs, but nothing had come up. The teen was smart. She knew how to disappear in plain sight. But Eliza wasn't just hiding in the way most runaway teens would. This wasn't about rebellion or a desire for independence. There was something more. The clues suggested that someone was helping her, and I didn't think it was just a stranger. She wasn't running toward freedom. She was running toward something or someone that was much darker. I spent the next few days sifting through the case files, reviewing the security footage from the bus station, and speaking with the detectives who were working the case. What struck me immediately was how little we knew about Eliza herself. There were no clear motives. She was a good student, a quiet girl by all accounts, and had no history of running away. The more I learned about her, the more I realized how out of character this was. She wasn't like the other teens I had encountered in similar cases. Something was off. Then the breakthrough came, a lead that no one had noticed until I took a closer look at her social media history. One of Eliza's last posts, made just a few days before she disappeared, was a cryptic photo of a car, a nondescript sedan, parked in front of a building that was oddly familiar. The building itself wasn't anything special, but the location was close to a warehouse district on the outskirts of Denver, an area that had been flagged for its connection to human trafficking rings. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give me a place to focus my search. I contacted a local contact in Denver, a retired detective now working as a private investigator, and we set out to investigate the warehouse district. We spent hours driving around the area, looking for any signs of activity. It was dark by the time we found it, an old, abandoned-looking building with minimal lighting and no obvious signs of life. There was a rusted chain-link fence surrounding the perimeter, but the gate was wide open. It looked like no one had been keeping watch, but I wasn't naive enough to assume it was unguarded. We decided to approach cautiously, staying to the shadows. As we moved closer, I began to feel that familiar sense of unease, the feeling that we were on the edge of something big, something dangerous. We waited in silence, listening for anything that might give us a clue. It was then that we saw movement in the distance. A man emerged from the side of the building, carrying a bundle of items that appeared to be clothing. He was walking quickly, and his eyes were darting around, looking over his shoulder. It was the sort of behavior that told me he wasn't supposed to be there, and certainly wasn't alone. I signaled to my contact, and we followed him at a safe distance, moving along the perimeter of the building. He led us to a back entrance, where we saw two other figures standing guard. There was no doubt now they were involved in something shady. But was it related to Eliza? I couldn't say for certain yet. We watched for several more hours as the group came and went. They seemed to be organizing something, moving supplies, setting up some kind of operation. Everything pointed towards something much larger than I had anticipated. That's when the unexpected happened. A vehicle pulled into the lot, a silver sedan identical to the one Eliza had posted about earlier. It was almost too coincidental, and yet there it was. I could feel my pulse quicken. I had no confirmation that Eliza was inside, but the timing was too perfect to ignore. We quickly contacted the local authorities, who moved in swiftly. Within minutes, a SWAT team had surrounded the building, cutting off all exits. The noise from the sirens and shouting was deafening, but it didn't drown out the sound of the door to the building slamming open. That's when I saw her. Eliza Hall, the missing teen, was pushed out of the building by one of the men who had been acting as a lookout. She was disoriented but alive. The relief I felt in that moment was overwhelming. Relief mixed with an anger I couldn't yet fully process. She was quickly taken into custody, though not as a suspect. She was a victim. Her involvement in the whole operation was unclear, but the fact that she was still alive was something to be thankful for. As we learned later, Eliza had been groomed and coerced into assisting a local trafficking syndicate. The situation was far more complex than we had imagined. She had been manipulated over the course of several months by a man she had met online, who convinced her that she needed to help him in order to protect her family. Her journey across states and into Colorado had been orchestrated by this man and his network, using her as a pawn. Her rescue wasn't the end of the story, though. It was only the beginning of unraveling a much larger human trafficking operation that had been operating quietly for years. And even though Eliza was safe, her recovery was far from simple. She would need months of counseling and support, and her road to healing would be long. But for now, she was home. The case stayed with me long after the immediate investigation was over. The quiet truth of it all haunted me. The way vulnerable people are preyed upon, the way manipulation can twist a young mind. Eliza's story was one of escape and survival, but it was also a warning about the hidden dangers that lurk in the corners of the world we live in. We may never fully understand why Eliza became a target, but her rescue proved that even in the darkest corners, there is always a chance for light to break through. Story 11, April 2025, began like any other month, full of possibilities and hope. For most people, the arrival of spring meant longer days, a touch of warmth in the air, and the promise of new beginnings. But as a freelance investigator, I had grown accustomed to finding the darker corners of society, places where secrets fester, and where the most bizarre and unsettling stories were waiting to be uncovered. That month, I was called in for a case that seemed, at first glance, almost too outlandish to be real. A 15-year-old boy in Western Sydney had been arrested for allegedly attempting to organize a series of contract killings across Europe. At first, it was dismissed as an impossible fiction. How could a teenager, just 15 years old, be involved in something so complex, so dangerous, and so global? But as I read the case file and the preliminary investigation notes, I knew there was more to this than met the eye. This wasn't the work of a lone, misguided teen. It was part of something much bigger, a dark web of contracts and criminal connections that span continents. This was a chilling glimpse into the growing problem of online crime syndicates, using encryption and anonymous platforms to carry out heinous acts without leaving a trace. I made my way to Sydney, unsure of what I would find, but certain that this case would not be as straightforward as the authorities thought. The first thing I learned upon arriving was that the teenager, Jackson Moore, had been arrested after an elaborate sting operation conducted by the Australian Federal Police, AFP, with help from international law enforcement agencies. The plot he had attempted to set in motion involved several targets in Denmark, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. These were high-profile individuals, business owners, politicians, even a few journalists. The authorities had uncovered the plot when they traced suspicious communications between Jackson and a network of individuals who appeared to be coordinating these killings. What struck me immediately was the fact that Jackson was not the typical type of person you'd expect to be involved in such an elaborate scheme. He came from a stable home, was a decent student, and had no known history of violent behavior. His parents, shocked and devastated by the news, couldn't believe that their son could be capable of such an act. They described him as a quiet teenager, someone who had always kept to himself, mostly spending time online. The police investigation had found that Jackson had been using encrypted messaging platforms to communicate with individuals across multiple countries. He had initially approached someone he met through an online gaming forum, offering a large sum of money for the killings of specific individuals. The transaction was set up through cryptocurrency, ensuring that there were no easy trails to follow. But as the investigation progressed, it became clear that Jackson wasn't working alone. He had been acting on behalf of someone, possibly even multiple people, who had been manipulating him from behind the screen. The more I dug into Jackson's background, the more I began to see the nuances of his involvement in this international conspiracy. Jackson had been targeted by someone, a shadowy figure who had been feeding him ideas and encouraging him to carry out the murders. In a sense, Jackson was both the perpetrator and a victim in this story. The more I learned about the man who had manipulated him, the more chilling it became. The person behind the plot had been operating on dark web forums, using psychological tactics to draw vulnerable individuals like Jackson into their web. The deeper I got, the more the case began to unfold like a twisted web of online manipulation and blackmail. Jackson had been coerced into thinking that the targets were responsible for a series of global injustices. He had been fed a narrative that twisted his view of reality, leading him to believe that by eliminating these individuals, he would be performing some sort of heroic act. As I continued to investigate, it became clear that the person orchestrating the plot was not just some random criminal. They had experience, a network, and an understanding of how to manipulate young minds. Jackson had become a pawn in a larger game, one that spanned across borders, fueled by digital connections and unseen forces. The first break in the case came when the authorities managed to track down one of the individuals Jackson had been communicating with, a man known only by his online alias Raven. Raven had been acting as a middleman, coordinating the hit list, and he had been in touch with several people in Europe who had been willing to carry out the killings for the right price. But when the police raided Raven's hideout, they found more than they expected. It wasn't just a matter of tracing one person. They discovered an entire underground network of people, including other teenagers, who were being recruited for similar schemes. It turned out that Jackson wasn't the first teenager Raven had manipulated. The network had been preying on vulnerable young people, often from stable homes, offering them money and promises of power in exchange for carrying out murders on behalf of various clients. They operated under the guise of a revolution, convincing their recruits that they were helping to change the world. But in reality, they were exploiting these teens, turning them into killers for hire. The more I uncovered, the more disturbing it became. The network was vast, spanning not just Europe, but the United States and even parts of Asia. They had successfully manipulated and recruited dozens of young people, using them as pawns to carry out high-profile assassinations. The online gaming world and social media platforms had become breeding grounds for this kind of exploitation. Teenagers, many of whom were seeking a sense of belonging or a way to make money, were lured into these schemes without ever realizing the true consequences of their actions. I knew I had to keep digging, but I also understood that the clock was ticking. As I compiled my findings and worked with law enforcement to put together a case against Raven and the network he was working for, I couldn't help but feel a sense of helplessness. How many more teenagers were out there, just like Jackson, caught in the web of online manipulation? How many more would fall victim to this kind of exploitation before it was too late? In the days that followed, Jackson's role in the plot became clearer. It was evident that he had been manipulated, but he had also been an active participant in the planning of the killings. His motivations were complex: fear, confusion, and the pressure to prove himself. In the end, Jackson was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder, but it was clear that the story didn't end with him. It was just the beginning of a much larger investigation into the criminal network that had preyed upon him and others. As the case unraveled, it became evident that the rise of digital manipulation and online crime syndicates was only just beginning. The tools and tactics used to manipulate vulnerable individuals were becoming more sophisticated, and the reach of these networks was growing. What started as an isolated case had uncovered a disturbing trend, one that could have far-reaching consequences for society at large. Jackson's story was a sobering reminder of the dark side of the internet, a place where manipulation and exploitation could thrive in the shadows, unnoticed by the outside world. As the investigation progressed, I couldn't help but wonder how many other young people were out there, just waiting to be pulled into the same web that had ensnared Jackson. In the end, I learned that this wasn't just a story about one teen and a murder-for-hire plot. It was about the dangers lurking online, where anyone, regardless of age, background, or intent, could be drawn into a world of violence and crime with a single click. And it was about the responsibility we all had to protect those most vulnerable to this kind of manipulation before it was too late. Story 12. April 2025 started with an uneventful calm. The early days of spring in Massachusetts, with its crisp mornings and budding trees, always felt like a time for renewal. But as a freelance investigator, I had learned long ago that when the seasons change, so do the stories, and not always for the better. It was on the afternoon of April 3rd that I received a call from an old contact in the Massachusetts State Police. The subject line of the message was simple: need you on a case. A murder staged as suicide. The name attached to the case was Carla Lorenzo de Silva, a woman in her early 30s found dead in her home in Lynn, Massachusetts. The authorities had initially ruled her death a suicide, a tragic yet common occurrence in a world where the mental health crisis had become a silent epidemic. But something about the scene didn't sit right. It was too neat, too contrived. The kind of scene a seasoned investigator might look at and instantly feel the weight of something darker lurking beneath the surface. Carla had been found hanging in her bedroom with a note nearby. The note was generic, depressingly familiar. A few lines hastily written, a declaration of hopelessness, of pain, of despair. The sort of thing the police had seen 1,000 times. There were no signs of forced entry, no witnesses. Everything pointed to a woman who, for reasons still unclear, had decided to take her own life. But as soon as I read through the initial reports, I knew there was more to this story. The scene, from the moment I read about it, screamed something deeper than simple despair. It screamed manipulation, control, and perhaps even something far more sinister: murder staged as suicide. I arrived in Lynn on April 5th. The house where Carla had lived was a modest, two-story home on the edge of town. From the outside, it looked like any other house in this quiet, blue-collar neighborhood. The kind of place where nothing out of the ordinary should ever happen. But the scene inside told a different story. The officers on the case were still gathering evidence, but the initial findings had only raised more questions. The rope that had supposedly been used for the hanging was tied in a way that seemed almost too perfect, too professional. The knot was tight, clean, and secure in a manner that didn't match the hurried, desperate tone of someone at the end of their rope. The body itself hadn't been found in the most typical of hanging positions either. It seemed like someone had arranged it to appear as if Carla had taken her own life, but in a way that didn't align with the natural signs of a suicide. What struck me further was the state of the bedroom. It was immaculate, almost sterile. The walls were bare, save for a single photograph of a child sitting on a shelf. There was nothing personal, nothing that reflected who Carla was as a person. A suicide note had been found near the bed, but no personal effects, no keepsakes, no clothing strewn about, suggested the scene had been the result of someone in turmoil. I spent the next several hours interviewing those closest to Carla. Friends, family, coworkers. All of them described her as quiet but kind, with a gentle, reserved nature. There were no indications that Carla had been struggling with severe mental health issues, though she had recently gone through a difficult breakup with her longtime partner. The breakup had caused some tension, but nothing that would suggest she was in such despair as to end her life. I spent the following day combing through her work history and financials. Nothing unusual there either. She had a steady job as an office manager for a small business in downtown Lynn, was known to be responsible with her finances, and had been saving up for a vacation that she had recently booked. Everything pointed to a woman who, despite her personal struggles, was taking steps toward a better future. There were no signs of someone teetering on the edge. By the time I made my way back to the scene of her death on April 7th, I had already begun to piece together some patterns, or rather, the absence of patterns. What I hadn't realized at first was that the entire setup had been too orchestrated, too meticulously arranged. The absence of a struggle, the cleanliness of a scene, and the particular way the rope had been tied. These weren't signs of a desperate woman. They were signs of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The forensic team, under the scrutiny of the state police, was now beginning to suspect foul play. They had found traces of a foreign substance on the clothes Carla had been wearing when her body was discovered. This substance, they learned, was a mild sedative, enough to incapacitate but not kill. It was a kind of thing someone could slip into a drink to make their victim easier to control. When they reviewed Carla's phone records, it became clear that she had received several calls in the days leading up to her death. The most suspicious of these was a call from a private number, made just a few hours before her body was discovered. The details of this call were deliberately obscured, but one thing was certain. It wasn't someone trying to help her. It was someone giving her orders. By April 10th, the investigation had taken a dramatic turn. Surveillance footage from a nearby store showed a man who had visited Carla's house the evening before her body was discovered. His face was partially obscured by a hat, but he appeared to be carrying a bag and looking around cautiously. The footage wasn't conclusive, but it was enough to launch a manhunt for the individual. At this point, the case became even more personal. The deeper I dug, the more I learned about the dark side of Carla's relationship with her ex-partner, Tiago Oliveira. Oliveira had been aggressive in their relationship, with a history of minor domestic violence. Though no charges had ever been filed against him, the police knew he had been in the area just before Carla's death. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Carla's death wasn't an isolated incident. It was connected to a pattern of abuse, one that had escalated to the point of murder. The man on the surveillance footage turned out to be Tiago Oliveira. His alibi crumbled under questioning, and within days, he was arrested on charges of murder. The investigation revealed that Tiago had meticulously staged the scene to make it appear as if Carla had taken her own life. The sedative had been slipped into a drink they had shared earlier that evening, rendering her unconscious. Tiago had then hung her, taking care to ensure that the scene looked like a suicide. The motive was not financial. Tiago didn't stand to gain from her death, but rather out of jealousy and possessiveness. He couldn't accept the fact that Carla had moved on from their tumultuous relationship. As I reviewed the evidence and worked alongside law enforcement to bring Tiago to justice, I couldn't help but reflect on the nature of control. The story of Carla Lorenzo da Silva was not just about a man who murdered a woman. It was about the systems of manipulation and domination that men like Tiago used to bend others to their will. It wasn't enough for him to take Carla's life. He needed to destroy her in a way that erased her agency, her dignity, and her memory. The staging of her death was the final act of a sickening control that had begun long before that night. The trial was set to begin in late 2025, and it was clear that the case would attract national attention. But even as justice seemed inevitable, I couldn't shake the feeling of frustration and sadness. Carla's life had been stolen, and her story had been turned into something ugly and tragic. Her family, devastated by her loss, would never be the same. But justice, though imperfect, would be served. And sometimes, that's all you can hope for. Story 13. It's hard to describe the feeling of a case unraveling beneath you, especially when that unraveling reveals something that wasn't supposed to exist, a wrong that's been carried on for years, a lie that has been left to fester until it bloomed into something unrecognizable. That's what I was faced with when the case of Wilma Robertson came to my attention in April 2025. I had been called in by a colleague from the Midwest, a detective who had worked tirelessly on a cold case review for the past few months. At first, it seemed like another routine review of an old case. Nothing out of the ordinary. Wilma Robertson, a 52-year-old woman, was found dead in her small home in Hanover, Indiana, in 2015. The official cause of death had been ruled as a blunt force trauma to the head, and the primary suspect was Sean Bailey, a man who had lived in the same neighborhood and was known to have had a heated argument with her weeks before the murder. Sean had been arrested for the crime almost immediately. The evidence against him seemed clear enough. There was a history of domestic conflict, some physical evidence that pointed to his involvement, and a witness who claimed to have seen him leave Wilma's home the night of the murder. He was convicted in 2016 and sentenced to 30 years in prison. But over the years, things didn't sit right. The conviction seemed too easy, too clean. As the years passed, Sean's lawyer, who had not been the most diligent in the initial trial, began to question whether they had missed something crucial. What followed was a series of investigations, appeals, and a growing conviction that Sean Bailey may not have been the one who had killed Wilma Robertson. When the case was brought to me in April 2025, it was already clear that something was amiss. The evidence that had been used to convict Sean was circumstantial at best. The physical evidence wasn't enough to definitively point to him, and the witness who had testified against him was, in hindsight, unreliable. As I reviewed the case files, I could sense the momentum shifting. This was no longer just a cold case, it was an unraveling mystery. And the more I pulled at the threads, the more the truth seemed to be just out of reach. Sean's exoneration didn't happen overnight. It took weeks of painstaking work, revisiting every aspect of the original investigation, re-interviewing witnesses, and analyzing the forensic evidence with a fresh set of eyes. It became clear that things had been overlooked during the initial trial, and there were gaps in the timeline that couldn't be explained away. I started to realize that the true story behind Wilma's murder had been buried beneath layers of assumptions and rushed conclusions. The breakthrough came when we managed to get access to the original forensic reports and a previously overlooked piece of evidence, a small scrap of fabric found near Wilma's body. It didn't match any of the clothes Sean had worn, nor did it match the typical fabrics found in her home. Upon further examination, we discovered it was a unique textile, one that wasn't widely available in Indiana at the time of the murder. We traced it back to a supplier in Illinois that had shipped fabric to a local tailor shop. The tailor shop in question had a reputation for making custom clothing, and one of its regular clients was Nigel Thomas, a man who had worked at a local factory with Wilma in the years leading up to her death. Nigel Thomas. I had heard his name mentioned briefly during my initial investigation, but no one had ever considered him a serious suspect. He had always flown under the radar, quiet, unassuming, a man with no known criminal history. But as we dug deeper, we began to uncover a pattern of behavior that was much more sinister than it first appeared. Nigel had a history of anger issues, and he had been known to have clashed with Wilma at work several times over the years. He was also a frequent visitor to her neighborhood, though no one had ever really connected the dots. The more we learned about Nigel Thomas, the more the case seemed to shift. There were reports of strange behavior in the days leading up to Wilma's death, disruptive phone calls, unprovoked confrontations, and a growing sense that he had been obsessed with her. And yet, in the original investigation, he had never been a person of interest. As the pieces started to come together, it became clear that the prosecution had missed something fundamental. They had focused on Sean Bailey, based on the assumption that their initial theories were correct. But they had failed to properly investigate Nigel Thomas, who, it now seemed, had been stalking Wilma, had been present the night of her death, and had likely been the one to kill her in a fit of rage. The physical evidence, the fabric, the previous history of violence, was pointing to one thing: Nigel Thomas was the murderer. The case was finally brought back to court in late April 2025, where the evidence was presented, and it didn't take long for the judge to rule in Sean Bailey's favor. The new forensic evidence was overwhelming, and the pattern of mistakes made during the original trial was too much to ignore. After nearly a decade in prison, Sean was exonerated. He was released on the 25th of April, 2025, a free man after having spent almost 9 years of his life in a prison cell for a crime he did not commit. Sean's exoneration was a bittersweet moment. While it was clear that he was relieved to be out of prison, there was no way to erase the damage done to his life. 9 years of lost time, relationships fractured, and a community that had branded him a murderer. It was a reminder of how the criminal justice system, though often a force for good, is not infallible. There are cracks in its foundation, and sometimes those cracks allow the innocent to fall through. For Sean, his release was a victory, but it was a hollow one. I spent time with Sean in the weeks after his release, helping him navigate the overwhelming changes in his life. The world had moved on without him. He had missed everything: birthdays, weddings, the birth of nieces and nephews, the death of family members. Everything was lost, and there was no way to get it back. In the end, the case was not just about exoneration. It was about redemption, not just for Sean, but for the truth. It was a reminder that justice, though elusive, can be found. But it is fragile, easily tainted by assumptions, biases, and the rush to close a case. As I left Indiana, heading back to my quiet life in the city, I thought about the thousands of cases out there, those that had been wrongfully closed, those that had gone unnoticed, and those where the truth was still buried, waiting to be uncovered. Sean Bailey's story had ended, but the lessons it imparted would stay with me. The search for truth is never easy. It's always messy, full of twists and turns, but it's worth it. Because, in the end, the truth is the only thing that can set us free.